Tim, my heartfelt thanks to you and Leeds Lodge for so kindly inviting me. I never take these invitations for granted, and it's a great honor to be with you. I must say, Tim, in the first part of your introduction, it could be a little bit of an exaggeration, but the second part certainly was not an exaggeration. It's a topic very much in vogue and something to be taken very seriously, and something on which I think theosophists can cast their own completely unique light on the world of science and philosophy. Let's start with a meditation, which I think is highly appropriate. This is from the Mahachohan, the great adept, of course. Between degrading superstition and still more degrading, brutal materialism, the white dove of truth has hardly room where to rest her weary, unwelcome foot. Well, humanity certainly stands at a critical juncture, even a bifurcation in human development and evolution. The Silicon Valley and World Economic Forum view of the human being is completely mechanistic. We are complex biological machines, and therefore our software needs to be enhanced and upgraded, just like a computer. And we are also hackable animals whose behavior can be nudged or manipulated or controlled, as was evident during the COVID-19 crisis. Now, this is the reductionist form of technocratic social engineering, and all life is seen as the product of matter and its interactions. And evolution is regarded as the enhancement of mechanistic attributes through technological development. The goal is the future human, or what they like to say, the post-human. And the post-human will be enhanced in terms of increasing intelligence, by which they mean cognitive abilities. This is the transhumanist stance. The spiritual or transpersonal view of the human being is that of an immortal spirit clothed in a mortal vesture. And evolution is regarded as spirit consciousness, seeking ever newer and better forms through the cyclic shedding of previous outworn forms in order to express its limitless potentiality. So the attainment of the fully human being is truth. Truth as love and wisdom. And this is the transcendent message. So let me share my screen. I was summarizing the different approaches of transhumanism that regards evolution really as an extension of matter, and the human body is essentially a material mechanism, and the transpersonal, whereby there is an immortal spirit clothed in a mortal vesture. So the 4 parts of this talk is, I'm going to describe transhumanism. It's a bit of a dark subject, but we need to know about it in order to argue sensibly. And then transcendence, and then very importantly, contrast the 2 approaches here. But then we ask, why do people yearn for immortality? What's the big deal about it? Do machines want to be immortal? I don't think so. So let's look at the first part here. And I'm going to describe its historical roots, its philosophical and intellectual ideology, and how transhumanists and cryonicists, those who like to freeze bodies in nitrogen, I'll come to that, and how they view the human being, and as a corollary, how they regard death and dying. So let's talk about the philosophical, the historical roots of transhumanism. It is really an intellectual philosophical movement which advocates the enhancement of the human condition by developing and making widely available sophisticated technologies, such as genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, cryonics, which is freezing a body in liquid nitrogen, and nanotechnology. Now, the fundamental ideas start in 1923 when the British geneticist J.B.S. Haldane advocated in his paper Daedalus, or Science and the Future. He read this out to the intellectual club at Cambridge University, and he predicted that great benefits would come from application of advanced sciences to human biology. And in particular, he was interested in the development of the science of eugenics here. And eugenics is the selective breeding. It's selective breeding, getting rid of unwanted genes. Ectogenesis, creating life in an artificial environment, and the application of genetics to improve human characteristics. And this is strongly coupled, of course, selective breeding with the idea of a master race. And these ideas were taken forward by, after Haldane, by the British biologist Sir Julian Huxley in his influential paper Transhumanism. But the word is actually used, transhumanism is used by the Canadian philosopher in his paper on the law of cosmic evolution and adaptation and an interpretation of recent thought. And Huxley was a leading member of the secular movement, arguing that humans should take control of their own destiny and enhance the human race by means of eugenics. The intention being to improve the human race, of course, by encouraging reproduction by people having desirable traits and discouraging those with undesirable traits. And Julian Huxley's idea of desirable traits was men of great scientific standing or men of great public service. And true to his word, Julian Huxley donated his sperm as his contribution to the future of humanity. Well, there's no arguing that the Huxley family was very eminent. It excelled in science, medicine, arts, literature, and public service. But this illustrious family was also afflicted by serious mental illness, breakdowns, and suicide. For example, Thomas Henley Huxley, the father of the Huxley family, suffered from periodical clinical depressions. His own father died in a Kent County lunatic asylum, and problems continued into the third generation of the Huxley family, and Julian Huxley himself suffered a number of breakdowns. So the law of heredity applies as much to the mental as to the bodily faculties. And here I must show you a slide that I took verbatim from a talk in the Royal Society. So full marks to the Royal Society for putting this on. Who do you think said this? Who proposed this in 1910, 1912? Compulsory sterilization. Well, it was the person we quite rightly revere, Winston Churchill, age 36. And in his letter to Asquith, he writes this. So I leave this with you. You can see how powerful these ideas were. So what is the philosophical and intellectual ideology of transhumanism? It's rooted entirely, of course, in a personality, egoistic concept of the human being as a biological mechanism. And so the body can be enhanced just like a mechanism. And worldview is entirely materialistic, of course. And transhumanist politics constitutes a group of political ideologies that generally express the belief in improving humans through science and technology. If a machine can be improved, so can a human being. And according to a 2006 European Parliament study, transhumanism is the political expression of the ideology that science and technology could be used to enhance human abilities and characteristics like physical beauty or lifespan. Specific topics include space migration and cryonic suspension. Yuval Harari is one of the leading advisors, the top advisor, to Klaus Schwab, the chairman of the World Economic Forum. And Harari says, I quote, "By hacking organisms, we gain power to re-engineer the future of life itself." I mean, that's really humble, isn't it? Because once you can hack something, you can also engineer it. Soon, he says, some corporations and governments will be able to systematically hack all people. And if they succeed in hacking life, he, the advisor to the World Economic Forum, says, it is the greatest revolution in biology since the beginning of life 4 billion years ago. I mean, just note the humility of all this, by the way. Now, cryonics is a subject very related to it. The Prospect of Immortality was published in 1962 by the American atheist and academic Robert Ettinger, who founded the Cryonics Institute and the Immortalist Society, and his book made quite an impact. And he said, would you like to live forever here on Earth? In the near future, this may become a real possibility. The prospect of immortality is a sober, scientific, logical argument founded on the undeniable fact that a body that's deep frozen stands a better chance of being revived than one rotting in the ground. And how many people who died 50 or 100 years ago of incurable diseases could now be cured now? Well, we don't need sober scientific proof of that. I know in this hot weather, if I leave my tomatoes out in the sun, they will rot more quickly than if I leave them in the fridge. But, you know, we're not allowed to argue with these scientists. So the cryonics procedure involves packing the body in ice immediately after death, replacing the water in the cells of the body with a kind of human antifreeze and storing the body head down in a tank full of liquid nitrogen at a temperature minus 196. Then eventually, when the supposed cure were found, the body would be defrosted, bringing the person back to life, when presumably they would regain their former consciousness. The Alcor Foundation, which handles all of this cryonic stuff, offers two options: a whole body preservation at a premium of $200,000 in 2020. And also you can preserve just your nervous system, whatever they mean by that, your brain and spinal cord, at a cost of $80,000. With surcharges for people in China. Incidentally, cryonics has nothing to do with the Egyptian system of mummifying the body. There's no question of the mummy being restored to life. So how do cryonicists, people who want to freeze their bodies, and transhumanists view the human being and death and dying? Well, here is the transhumanist view of the human being, and that large hole in the middle of this chap's chest means he's obviously got no soul. How can you have a soul? So the view is human being equals body, dying means loss of physical function, especially brain, which produces consciousness, and death equals brain death, hence extinction of cognitive function. The transhumanist dream is enhancing cognitive function. The transcendent view is ever increasing our capacity to love. So the post-human being is the transhumanist dream, which is an extension, it's a linear extension of his current capacities. So how then do these transhumanists propose to technologically and genetically engineer the post-human dream to resurrect the dead and achieve immortality? Well, one of the most, if I can use the word, erudite and detailed papers that you can find is by two Russians. Firstly, this is what it is. And this is what their paper is all about. And here is the academic journal in which it has been published. The highlights of the whole procedure are this. You resurrect and reconstruct the personality and solve the problem of personal identity. And given large-scale technological development, resurrection is completely inevitable. And the main player in this is powerful artificial intelligence powered by Dyson spheres. And then a combination of random mind generation and acausal trade between parallel worlds. Dyson spheres, by the way, are a hypothetical futurist technological idea of megastructures around the stars in order to capture a larger proportion of their energy. So these are the highlights, and he has produced a map of resurrection for the dead. And you don't have to obviously read all of this, but you can see the detail into which they go and how seriously they take it. Reconstruction by AI, new world models, quantum immortality, partial resurrection, and transcendental resurrection. And if you want a timeline, here's your immortality roadmap from now to probably 2100, but definitely 2600. Now, I cannot emphasize too strongly, if you think that this is just the pipe dream of some geek, it is taken very seriously in academia. Oxford University have a Future of Humanity Institute. And one of their fellows is Anders Sandberg, a James Martin Fellow. Julian Savulescu is Professor of Practical Ethics, or bioethicist. I leave you to decide what is practical about it. So it's taken very seriously. By way of a quick summary of their roadmap, You're going to be immortal probably in 2100, but definitely in 2600 to be sure. And we are also promised all of this. We're going to solve the question of the end of the universe. And how humble we all are trying to solve the question of the end of the universe. So let's move on to a rather more pleasant topic, transcendence. The vital importance of understanding the metaphysical constitution of the nature of man. And the most important part of my talk will be this, the active connection between the mortal and the immortal aspects of man. We're familiar with these sort of diagrams, but let's remind ourselves, we are one human being, but we can view ourselves in terms of our dual nature of individuality and personality, which can be fractionated into spirit, body, and the interface, which is soul. Most significantly, and this is where occult science is absolutely supreme, we have the sevenfold division, sevenfold aspects of man, or the fivefold, which in the Parsi Zoroastrian religion I've shown in this way, just to show that the ancient wisdom is not just an invention of theosophists, but it is really the backdrop of theosophical thought. The absolutely vital thing to note here is this, the Antakarana, which is the bridge between the mortal aspects and the immortal. So let's go into the incredible teaching on the Antakarana. So it is man's spiritual or umbilical life support. And Antakarana simply means the internal instrument. Anta, interior, and karana, the sense organ. Its role is the way of communicating between the higher self as parent and the lower self, the personality, its child. The relation between parent and child is highly significant, not only, of course, between our real parents and us as children when we were children, but that principle, the principle of parent and child, and the connection between them is highly significant. What the Antakarana is, it's a projection of the lower manas, the lower mind, acting as this bridge. And at death, it is the conveyor of all thoughts of a spiritual nature that during personal life could be absorbed into the higher self. And of course, we are only talking of spiritual aspirations that are absorbed into the higher self. Nothing of the personal life or personal desires have any relevance whatsoever. So amplifying this with the average person, I certainly include myself there is the parent as higher self, the child as the lower self, the personality, if you like. And there is the Antakarana. I like to view the Antakarana in terms of analogy as an electrical conduit. In order for the parent to take control and discipline of the child, there has to be a flow from one to the other. So let's liken the antakarana to an umbilical, an electrical umbilical. Now, if we continue in our life developing ourselves, good thoughts, philanthropy, active service, meditation, watching our negativity, and always concentrating on the good, the true, and the beautiful, what we do is we strengthen this electrical connection. So we are, so to speak, creating more wires so that the current from the parent to the child can flow even more strongly. So when we reach a stage of fulfillment, such that we become the sage or the seer or the genius, we have almost absorbed the lower nature into the higher nature. And this I'm calling the sage, of course. Now, conversely, unfortunately, the more selfish our thinking, the more personal, the more self-centered, the more cruel, the worse we manage ourselves, the more we're going to thin this connection between the parent and the child, between the higher self and the lower self. So the more sinful we are, the more selfish and cruel we are thinning down this vital umbilical connection. And there comes a stage where the current, so to speak, from parent to child is so strong that the flimsy little wire can no longer sustain it, and then there is a break. And that break is a terrible thing. And then we have the phenomenon of Jekyll and Hyde, soulless men, a human animal, and a scourge, as Blavatsky puts it. So if there exists even one flimsy little hairline breadth of the electrical wire connecting parent with child, there is a possibility of a reunion. In the Eastern parable, the higher self is likened to a master who sends out his laborers to till the ground and to gather the harvest. And he is content to keep the fields so long as there is even the very smallest return. But when the ground becomes sterile, not only is the ground abandoned, but the laborer, meaning the higher self, also perishes. So for the average person, the antakarana disintegrates at death and remains and survives for a while as the kamarupa, or shell. Blavatsky mentions the example of the Scottish novelist Robert Louis Stevenson, who glimpsed a true vision in his incredible book, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, about the struggle between the good and evil that Dr. Jekyll faced, and how in the end his own good nature was overpowered by the evil in himself, which is a perfect allegorical account of the dreadful catastrophe resulting from a premature destruction of the antakarana, when the psychophysical lower animal, lower self, detaches from its divine parent. So this archetypal tale of a man taken over by his dark side has become an entrenched metaphor of the shadow. And there is no shortage of modern examples, I'm afraid, of this. Blavatsky cites the example of Jack the Ripper as a typical one. Nowadays, we're not short of brutal lone serial killers who prey on young women and children. And of course, we prefer not to mention any names. But it is also my persuasion that the monstrous crimes perpetrated against humanity by totalitarian dictators and their henchmen may also be due to this total severance of the antichorionic connection, freeing, therefore, the animal nature to run amok without any conscience or conscience bestowing connection to its parent self. So let Blavatsky continue on this whole subject of soulless human beings or soulless beings. There are two kinds of soulless beings on earth, and their fate is somewhat different. One kind, men who have lost their higher self in a present incarnation. And the other kind is men who are severed from the spiritual soul in a preceding birth. The first kind, those who lose their connection in the present incarnation, their fate is avicii. Avicii, known as the waveless state, it is the nether pole of Devachan. In Devachan, we assimilate and work on our spiritual aspirations. Avicii is the exact contrast of that. Having garnered no spiritual harvest, there is nothing to work in Devachan, so Avicii is the only result. Now, animal cunning, as Blavatsky intimates, is not so easily discerned, since these sort of people can possess much charm and influence and are extremely intellectual. But it is my persuasion that the extent to which a person displays cunning and manipulative characteristics, never to be confused with intelligence and disciplined authority, to that extent, such a person is an agent or an instrument for the workings of dark forces. And such people can be found in all walks of life, including, I'm afraid, spiritual societies. So it is even nowadays that neither religion nor science nor psychiatry has the least suspicion that such facts actually exist in nature. And it is occult science par excellence that supplies the missing pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. So what happens when the lower self, the child so-called, detaches and gets cut off from the higher parental influence? Its future is terrible, but even more so, it is terrible for humanity. It is not just terrible for itself, but also for humanity. And here lies a clue to that chit-chat, small talk we often hear at dinner parties and such stuff. If God loves, how come there is so much evil? How do you explain when God loves us all, there's so much evil? We hear this time and time and time again. Well, here you have more than just the clue, because it sometimes happens that after the separation, the exhausted soul, the animal nature, becomes so completely animal that it fades out in Kamaloka, in Purgatorio, the first after-death state, as all other animal souls do. But given the material mind, the longer it lasts in that stage, it frequently happens that after the actual life of the soulless man is ended, he is again reincarnated frequently into new personalities, each one more abject than the other, because the impulse of animal life is too strong and it cannot wear itself out in just one or two lives. But in rarer cases, a more dreadful thing may happen. So when the lower self is doomed to exhaustion by starvation, by spiritual starvation, it becomes a so-called spook, a karma manasic spook, that in occultism is referred to as the dweller on the threshold, described by Lord Bulwer-Lytton in his beautiful novel Zanoni, which is not just a novel, but a true statement of fact. So then what happens is the dweller, the spook, is led by affinity and by attraction, and it forces itself into the astral current and through the auric envelope of the new personality that the higher self, the parent, has taken on. It forces itself into the aura of the new personality and infiltrates it and declares war on that personality. And it is very important to appreciate that soulless men are not just on earth, but they also hang around as invisible but potent ghouls. And there is so much infection in the mental atmosphere we see around us. And I cannot but help thinking that a lot of it, not all of it, of course, it's very complicated, a lot of it is due to this influence. So in summary, the fate of the lower self and to humanity when cut off from the parent self is repeated incarnation into several new personalities before ultimately fading out, or worse still, becoming the spook or the dweller on the threshold and infiltrating the new personality inhabited by the parent ego. So in summary, bereft of its guiding principle, but strengthened by the material elements, the lower self becomes an independent entity. And after suffering itself to sink lower and lower on the animal plane, when the hour strikes for its earthly body to die, it is either immediately reborn or remains like this spook. Now, for goodness sake, I'm not saying that all transhumanists and all cryonicists have lost their souls. But what I am saying, and I'm saying it quite strongly, is that the path that they are following, which is the path of brutal materialism, and that path they can only discover the physical nature. And if you keep following that path in that direction, there is only going to be one outcome, ultimately. The steps down to the abyss are not infinite. There are a number of steps. You can take many steps down, but ultimately you take the last step before you fall into the abyss. So I'm not, for goodness sake, saying all transhumanists have lost their souls, but I am saying that the path they are following is leading in that direction. For, as Blavatsky warns, we elbow soulless men and women at every step of life. Let's just contrast the transhumanist and the transcendent by way of a summary. Either we are complex biological machines and life is a product of matter and its interaction, and the goal is ever increasing intelligence, achieved by enhancing present capacities. Or we are immortal spirit, clothed in immortal vesture for life on earth. And just as our mortal clothes in our wardrobe get worn out and have to be replaced, similarly, we have to change our mortal vesture, but we will prevail because we are immortal. We are divine consciousness. And the goal is the attainment of the full flowering of every human potentiality through a qualitative evolutionary change of state. Now, I'd like to pose these questions to cryonicists and transhumanists. About, I know, roughly well over 3,000 people have volunteered for a full body immersion in liquid nitrogen, including Walt Disney, including Robert Ettinger, who first suggested it, and including the American baseball star Ted Williams, who decided to have his head and his body separately frozen. So I pose these questions to these cryonicists. Given that a Russian scientist performed dog head transplants resulting in two-headed dogs, which inspired Robert White to transplant monkey heads, one on top of one grafted on the other, which creature could apparently hear, smell, taste, eat, and follow objects with his four eyes. He's meant to be a devout Roman Catholic. And if you read his biography, actually, he was true to his word. He had 10 children and one wife. And he would pray before every surgical operation, and he performed thousands of them. I leave it to your imagination whether he prayed before grafting a poor monkey's head onto another. But reasoning along similar lines, transhumanists are saying that why can't one person's head be grafted onto another body? And there is an Italian surgeon who's seriously, Cambanero, trying to do this. So then, if that were even hypothetically possible, I ask, when one cryoperson, corpse, is defrosted and brought back to life, is the person then immortal? If transhumanism and artificial intelligence are strongly coupled, would the outcome be complete blurring of the sense of self and an erosion of the unique distinction between a human being and a machine? And what do they mean by reconstruction of the identity of the deceased in old age? Would it mean restoring a defrosted body full of wrinkles in old age and restoring it to its former youth? So you can see the sort of nonsense that's behind this, which people are taking very seriously. But the most important point is, what is the driving force behind such frantic attempts to attain immortality? Where does that desire come from? From what level does it arise? Why don't other pieces of machinery, even computers, sorry about the spelling mistake, yearn for immortality? So these are the sort of serious fallacies that can't be answered, but the standard answer is science will develop to such an extent that we can do all of this. So finally, why does man yearn for immortality? That most beautiful and divine of all books, The Voice of the Silence, talks about the two classes of human being. The self of matter and the self of spirit can never meet. one must disappear. There is no place for both. What do we mean by the self of matter and the, in capitals, self of spirit? Now, if we recall that the word matter is just a general term comprising a virtually infinite number of degrees of increasing refinement, from the gross physical to the most ethereal. So those who are instinctively drawn to the nature of matter will choose the path of matter, known as the path of the shadows. And those who tread the path of the shadows are referred to in occultism by the quaint term brothers of the shadow. And their motives are essentially self-seeking. Any extraordinary powers and faculties attained are turned to personal gain for power and control. So obviously, when taken to extremes, they descend to the left-hand path of sorcery, or worse still, black magic. So here you have the brothers of the shadow. Their approach, their attitude is mainly centripetal, inward-looking. Everything is towards me, me, and mine. By contrast, of course, we have the self of spirit. These few are known as the sons of light. And their approach is centrifugal, looking outwards to all humanity. Their approach is universal, not personal. So multitudes of human beings are unconsciously treading the path of the shadows, and we are, as Blavatsky says, elbowing them all the time. And relatively few are following consciously the right-hand path of self-renunciation and self-conquest, compassion, and expansion of heart. But the divergence is clear-cut between the centripetal and the centrifugal, the self-centered and the expansive characteristic. That is why Blavatsky says, one of the twain must disappear. There is no place for both. And there is a supreme logic in this. Attempting to walk both paths would be as absurd as trying to be both misanthropic and philanthropic at one and the same time, or attempting to cross a bridge, leaving one foot behind on the former bank. What then are the repercussions for humanity? We display an infinite spectrum of consciousness. Remember this beautiful quote in the Key to Theosophy from Plato, that when the soul rises and allies herself with nous, the rational soul, all will be well. Alternatively, we can attach ourselves to Anoia. When we rise to nous, we lend a hand to those who fall. When we sink to Anoia, we trample on those who have fallen. So here you have the spectrum between unspeakable brutality and ineffable transcendence. These are the qualities of the transcendent, and these are the characteristics of the brutal. And two quotations, just to illustrate the point, two modern quotations, one from the late Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, that everyone in her Christmas speech, everyone is our neighbor. It's strongly reminiscent of the first object of the Theosophical Society. I'm sure she must have read that. No matter what race, creed, or color. By contrast, we can also do this. We have various weapons of destruction, and we will use all means available to us. And I'm not bluffing. So you can see the spectrum of humanity, all to do with our state of consciousness. So beautifully stated in The Voice of the Silence: when we are ignorant, when we are learning, and when we are in the hall of wisdom. I'd like to think that most of us, all of us, are in the hall of learning, where we are warned that, yes, we will find blossoms, but under every blossom you find a serpent coiled around the stem. So to conclude, there cannot be even one single transhumanist or cryonicist who would not revolt at the idea of eating filth from the gutters. But these same people need to understand that hygiene applies as much to the world of physical matter as it does to the realm of mind, and that some of the latest ideas and experiments in science regarding transhumanism and cryonics, these are the scientific intellectual equivalent of utter filth. Simple, even illiterate folk who go about their ordinary daily lives devoted to their families, tending to a sick relative, who spend days toiling in the fields or hunched up in the office behind a computer or in the factory at a monotonous job, they're not fooled by all this highfalutin intellectual froth coming even from Oxford University. Because being more in touch with the heartbeat of life, they inwardly sense that a theory or idea in vogue that attracts the highbrows of academia does not necessarily make it more valid or beneficial to life and society. These ordinary people may not have academic qualifications or scientific training or written erudite books, but they instinctively feel and know in their heart of hearts that hidden influences, mystery, and magic cast their invisible spell over our lives and raise us from the rank of selfish genes and manufactured robots to the dignity of the gods. So let us conclude with a saying from one who truly raised consciousness to the dignity of the gods. This was written age 31.